Hey, we're taught we were monsters, savages without honor or soul. They expected barbed wire, starvation, and despair. So why were American prison camps showing their enemy Hollywood movies? Why did the sound of jazz music float over the fences instead of screams? This is the true story of a soldier who crossed the deepest divide not with a weapon, but with a reel of film. This is the story of the day hate was silenced, and hope played the loudest note. One man held on to his past like a weapon. The other believed in a future he couldn't yet see. And in the most unlikely place on earth, they found a common language. Get ready for a story that will challenge everything you think you know about war, enemies, and the power of a simple melody. Stories like this remind us of our shared humanity. If you're ready for more transformative journeys, subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and turn on notifications so you never miss an inspiring true story. The Wall of Silence. The Arizona sun was a merciless, white-hot coin nailed to a vast, bleached sky. It baked the desert floor, sending heat shimmers dancing over the distant mesas, and cooking the air inside Camp Harmony until it was thin and brittle. Corporal Jack Miller, at 28, felt the weight of that sun on the back of his neck, like a physical press. His olive-drab uniform was a damp second skin, and the air he breathed was dust, the fine, talcum powder grit of the desert that got everywhere. His teeth, his eyes, the creases of his map. Camp Harmony. The name was a joke someone in Washington had thought was clever. There was no harmony here. There was only a profound, suffocating silence, broken by the crunch of gravel under his own boot heels and the occasional, distant call of a guard from the watchtowers. The camp itself was a stark geometric scar on the landscape. Neat rows of barracks, identical in their drabness, were surrounded by a double fence of barbed wire that glittered with a cruel, sharp light. But the real wall wasn't made of wire or wood. It was invisible, built from something far stronger, a rigid, unyielding silence from the 900 Japanese soldiers held within. Jack paused his patrol, mopping his brow with a sleeve. He watched them. They moved through the compound like ghosts, their movements economical, their eyes perpetually averted, fixed on the dust at their feet or some distant, internal horizon. Their faces were closed doors, masks of stoic discipline that revealed nothing. Not fear, not anger, not hope. They had been taught he was a monster, a barbarian. Their refusal to engage, to even look at him, was their last weapon, and they wielded it with devastating effectiveness. He believed in the camp's mission, or at least, he wanted to. Colonel Jenkins, a man who looked more like a history professor than a military commander with his wire-rimmed glasses and thoughtful frown, had instituted policies that made other camps raise eyebrows. Full rations, as per the Geneva Convention, baseball equipment, a camp library with donated books, and now, his most ambitious project yet, weekly movie nights. We are not just containing men. Corporal Miller, the colonel had said that morning, his voice calm but firm in the stuffy office. We are engaged in a different kind of warfare, a warfare of ideas. We are demonstrating the very principles of dignity and compassion that we are fighting for over there. We will show them who we truly are. Jack had nodded, the idealistic words ringing in his ears. But out here in the oppressive silence of the yard, that idealism felt fragile, like a paper boat in a storm. His specific duty was to oversee the camp's newly formed entertainment committee, a farcical assignment that involved trying to get a group of sullen, resistant prisoners to cooperate in setting up these diversions. The heart of this resistance, its quiet, unwavering core, was a man named Kenji Tanaka. Jack had learned his name from the files. 32 years old, a history teacher from Kyoto, captured in the Dutch East Indies. He wasn't the largest or the most physically imposing of the prisoners, but he carried an aura of unassailable authority. His posture was always ramrod straight, even when performing the most menial task. His eyes, when they occasionally flickered up, held a cold, intellectual fire that seemed to look straight through Jack's uniform and into the hollow, uncertain man beneath. To Kenji Tanaka, Jack was certain the movie projector sitting in the supply shed wasn't a source of entertainment. It was an instrument of propaganda. The jazz records the colonel played over the camp's loudspeakers were not music, but vulgar, corrupting noise. America's kindness was not compassion. It was a weak, deceitful trick, a psychological tactic to erode their spirit and their unwavering loyalty to the Emperor. The conflict Jack had been dreading materialized that afternoon. The shipment had arrived, a giant, heavy roll of white canvas with movie screen, along with lumber for the frame. Colonel Jenkins's orders were clear. The prisoners were to build it. Jack assembled the so-called committee, 5 men, including Tanaka, who stood before him with expressionless faces. Jack explained the task, gesturing to materials, trying to inject a tone of casual opportunity into his voice. There was a long silence. Kenji Tanaka took a small step forward. He did not look at Jack, but at a point somewhere on his chest. "We must decline," Tanaka said, his English precise, formal, and icy. "It is not our duty to build such a thing." A flush of frustration warmed Jack's neck. "It's not about duty. Look, it's something to do. Something different. A movie for everyone." Tanaka's gaze remained fixed. He translated Jack's words to the others, his tone flat. The other 4 men did not react. They were statues. "Your monotony is not our concern," Tanaka said, carefully choosing the word. "We will not build your propaganda tower." The word propaganda hung in the air, as tangible and heavy as the heat. The other prisoners stood rigidly behind him, a silent, unified front. Jack felt the colonel's entire idealistic project crumbling into the dust right there on its first day. This was more than simple refusal. It was a moral stand. They would accept food and shelter, the bare necessities required by international law. But they would not participate in what they saw as the corruption of their culture. The external conflict was clear and simple: orders versus mutiny. He could force the issue, have them thrown into the isolation brig for insubordination. But that would be a victory for no one. It would only prove Tanaka's point about their captive brutality. But as Jack looked at Kenji Tanaka, he didn't just see an enemy soldier. He saw a man of principle, a teacher, fiercely intelligent and clinging to the core of his identity with every fiber of his being. He was defending his world, a world that was crumbling thousands of miles away, with the only weapons he had left, his will and his silence. In that moment, Jack's mission transformed. It was no longer about following the colonel's orders to put on a show. It became a personal, daunting challenge. The puzzle was no longer logistical. It was human. How do you reach a man who believes you are a demon? How do you show him a glimpse of your humanity when his entire worldview depends on you having none? The wall was high, and it was thick, and Corporal Jack Miller had no idea how to begin scaling it. He only knew that he had to try. The architecture of a soul. The silence in the days that followed the standoff was heavier, more profound. It was no longer just the absence of sound. It was an active entity, a third party in every interaction. Corporal Jack Miller felt it pressing down on the camp, a suffocating blanket woven from pride, defiance, and a deep, unspoken fear. He saw the way the other prisoners looked at Kenji Tanaka now, not just with respect, but with a fervent, almost religious devotion. He had stood against the American machine and not broken. He was their unassailable rock. Jack, however, felt like he was drowning in that silence. Colonel Jenkins had taken the news of the refusal with a frustratingly calm nod. The wall wasn't built in a day, Miller, and it won't be torn down in one. Patience. Persistence. The advice fell hollow. How did one be patient with a wall that refused to acknowledge you existed? He abandoned direct confrontation. Orders were useless here. Instead, he began to haunt the edges of their world, a quiet observer. He spent more time in the camp's library, a dusty, sun-bleached barrack that smelled of old paper and despair. It was here, amidst donated volumes of Zane Grey westerns and outdated agricultural manuals, that he found his first thread. Kenji Tanaka was there almost every afternoon. He would sit at a small, rickety table, his posture impossibly erect, handling the books with a reverence that seemed out of place in the bleak camp. He wasn't just reading. He was studying, his fingers tracing illustrations and diagrams with a delicate focus that softened the harsh lines of his face. One particularly windy afternoon, a gust tore through the open door, whipping dust into a frenzy and sending papers flying. It caught the book Kenji was holding, a heavy, illustrated volume on European cathedrals, and ripped a delicate page clean out. The page, a detailed etching of the intricate facade of the Duomo in Florence, fluttered wildly like a wounded bird. Instinct took over. Both men moved at once, their previous roles of guard and prisoner forgotten in the face of saving something beautiful from being trampled in the dust. Jack lunged, his hand closing around one corner of the paper just as Kenji's fingers, surprisingly graceful, secured the other. They froze there, crouched on the rough wooden floor, their hands inches apart on the same page, their breath coming quickly. The moment stretched, charged with shared, unexpected purpose. Kenji was the first to move. Slowly, carefully, he drew the page toward him, his touch gentle as he smoothed it flat against the table. His brow was furrowed in concentration, his anger from days before completely absent, replaced by a pure, focused concern for preservation of this art. "Thank you," Jack said, the words feeling inadequate and strangely personal. Kenji did not look up, his attention wholly on realigning the torn edge. "It is a significant work," he said softly, his voice low, "a testament to what men can achieve. It should not be lost to carelessness." The word carelessness was an accusation. It was a statement of fact, a universal principle he held dear. Jack seized the opening, treading as carefully as if he were on ice. "Is that your interest?" "Architecture." Kenji finally glanced up, his dark eyes meeting Jack's for a fleeting second before returning to the page. "An appreciation for structure," he corrected, his tone not unfriendly, but precise. "For what men can build when they're inspired by a higher purpose, not when they're ordered." The subtle rebuke of their last encounter was there, but was muted, almost philosophical now. It was a first crack, tiny but real. Jack left the library with his heart hammering against his ribs, not from fear or frustration, but from a sudden, electrifying sense of possibility. He had seen a glimpse of the man behind the soldier, the teacher behind the prisoner. He was a man who valued creation over destruction, order over chaos, beauty over brutality. That evening, as he looked over film reels in the storage shed, his plan changed. The colonel had sent a new shipment, a John Wayne Western, a newsreel, and one other tucked away in the back. It was The Great Ziegfeld, a musical extravaganza from 1936. It was 3 hours of pure, unadulterated American spectacle, song, dance, and lavish sets. It was on the surface, the worst kind of propaganda, a display of outrageous wealth and excess. But Jack thought of Kenji Tanaka's fingers tracing the stonework of cathedral. He wasn't trying to sell him America. He was trying to show him creation. That night, without a screen, the Americans set up projector anyway. Its mechanical was a strange, alien sound in the desert twilight. They pointed it at the only blank, flat surface available, the whitewashed wall of the mess hall. A square of light flickered to life, dancing on the adobe. The prisoners, curious despite themselves, emerged from their barracks. They did not gather, but stood apart in the shadows, dark silhouettes against the fading desert light. Jack saw Kenji among them, standing in the doorway of his barack, his arms crossed, a statue of silent disapproval. Then the music started. The opening credits gave way to the film's piece de resistance. A Pretty Girl is like a melody number. The screen, the wall, exploded into a staggering vision of opulence. A massive, revolving staircase teemed with hundreds of dancers in exquisite costumes. The symphony swelled, a tidal wave of sound and coordinated movement that was utterly alien to everything in the stark, dusty camp. The prisoners didn't cheer. They didn't smile. But they didn't look away. Their rigid postures softened by a fraction. The defiant silence was replaced by a mesmerized one. This was not a John Wayne cowboy shooting a villain. This was something beyond their comprehension, a world of impossible beauty and artistic ambition that transcended language and nationality. Jack's eyes were fixed on Kenji. The man hadn't moved, but in the flickering light from the projector, Jack saw it. The slightest tilt of his head, a minute widening of his eyes. The awe was there, naked and unguarded for a single second before his features schooled themselves back into impassivity. The American propaganda was a lie, but this spectacle of pure human creativity, this was a language that bypassed politics and patriotism entirely. It spoke directly to the part of him that cherished the Duomo's etched lines. The film played on, a river of light and music flowing over the wall. The battle was no longer about winning or losing. Jack had found a chink in the armor, not by force, but by presenting a different kind of truth. He had offered a glimpse of a cathedral made of light, and for a moment, the teacher from Kyoto had looked up from his despair and remembered what it was to be inspired. The blueprint of a truce. A new, peculiar tension hummed in the dry Arizona air the morning after the movie. It was no longer the stark, binary opposition of before, but a complex, low-grade current of curiosity and confusion. The prisoners went about their duties, but their eyes, once permanently downcast, now flickered with a hesitant energy. They had witnessed something that didn't fit the narrative of their captors as crude barbarians. They had seen art, and art as a way of seeding doubt in the most fortified of minds. Corporal Jack Miller felt it. He reported to Colonel Jenkins's office, the image of Kenji Tanaka's unguarded moment of awe still burning in his mind. The colonel listened, steepling his fingers, a faint, knowing smile playing on his lips. A musical Miller? The great Ziegfeld? That's a bold choice. Not exactly a patriotic call to arms, the colonel remarked, his tone light, but his eyes sharp behind his glasses. It wasn't about patriotism, sir. Jack found himself explaining, the realization solidifying as he spoke the words. It was about scale, ambition. It was something so entirely foreign, so massive, they couldn't just ignore it. It wasn't an argument. It was a spectacle. The colonel nodded slowly. I've read the overnight reports. It says Tanaka watched the entire 3-hour runtime. And now he's apparently asking one of the interpreters about the structural engineering of the rotating staircase set. He let out a soft, incredulous chuckle. The man is a fascinating puzzle, isn't he? A history teacher captivated by engineering and spectacle. Jack agreed, but his agreement turned to ice in his veins with the colonel's next words. Good. Then he's engaged. I'm assigning him to your detail. Officially, you and he will build the projection screen together. Those are the orders. The bottom dropped out of Jack's stomach. Sir, with all due respect, forcing him that will undo everything. It'll be seen as a punishment, a loss of face. He'll dig in harder than ever. Visions of the previous standoff flashed before his eyes, this time with the added bitterness of betrayed, nascent trust. It's not a request, Corporal. It's an opportunity. For both of you, the colonel said, his voice leaving no room for debate. Dismissed. The walk to the compound felt like a march to the gallows. The lumber and the giant roll of canvas sat in the dust, taunting him. He found Kenji Tanaka not with the others, but standing alone near the library barracks, his gaze distant, as if still calculating the load-bearing weight of a cinematic staircase. Jack approached, the new orders sitting like ash on his tongue. Tanaka, he began, his voice tighter than he intended. New orders. From Colonel Jenkins. You and I were building the screen. Today, he watched the shutter slam down behind Kenji's eyes. The faint trace of intellectual curiosity that had been there moments before vanished, replaced by the familiar, impenetrable coldness. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. This is a punishment, Kenji stated flatly. It wasn't a question. It was a declaration of fact. For his moment of weakness, for showing interest, he was being publicly condemned to manual labor for the enemy. Jack knew he had one chance. He couldn't present this as an order. He had to frame it as the colonel had. An opportunity. He remembered Kenji's words in the library, his precise, reverent language. No, Jack said, forcing his voice to be calm. He gestured to the pile of fresh-cut lumber. It's a structure, and I was told you have an appreciation for what men can build when they are inspired. He paused, letting the words hang between them, a direct callback to their moment over the torn etching. Then he played his only card. The colonel has the reels for The Wizard of Oz. I'm told the production design is significant. Technicolor. Entire worlds built from scratch. He saw the conflict ignite within Kenji Tanaka. It was a war waged in the subtle tightening around his mouth, the slight tremor in his hands that he stilled by clenching them into fists. His duty to his men, to their collective defiance, demanded he refuse again. to accept isolation or punishment rather than comply. But his intellectual soul, the part of him that was a scholar and an admirer of monumental achievement, was fiercely intrigued. The promise of a new world of artistic engineering was a siren's call he was struggling to resist. He was being asked to choose between his identity as a resistant leader and his identity as a lifelong learner. The silence stretched, agonizing. Jack could feel the eyes of other prisoners on them from a distance, watching their leader's moment of reckoning. Finally, Kenji gave a single, sharp, jerky nod. It was not a gesture of submission, but a pragmatic capitulation to a stronger curiosity. The design must be sound, he said, his voice clipped and formal, erecting a professional boundary around the task. It must bear the weight of the canvas without swaying the wind. It will be an engineering problem. I will solve the engineering problem. And so, the most unlikely alliance in Camp Harmony began. Jack, with his raw, practical strength and American can-do attitude, and Kenji, with his meticulous mathematical mind. They didn't speak much. Their communication was a series of grunts, gestures, and terse, technical exchanges. Hold this plank here. The angle is incorrect. It must be adjusted 15 degrees for maximum stability. Like this? Adequate. Jack hauled and sawed. Kenji measured and directed, using a stick to draw precise angles in the dust. He would sight down the length of a beam, his eyes critical, ensuring everything was perfectly plumb and level. A rhythm developed, a grudging, unspoken synergy. They were two craftsmen focused on a shared task, the politics of their situation temporarily suspended by the simple need to build something well. But the tension was far from gone. It had merely shifted. Jack was acutely aware of the other prisoners, stopping their work to watch. Their expressions were no longer just confused. Some were dark, clouded with betrayal. Their rock, their unwavering symbol of defiance, was now taking orders from the American, hammering nails into a frame for their enemy's propaganda. Whispers spread to the compound like a dry wind. Was Tanaka losing his honor? Was he breaking? Or was this some brilliant, deeper strategy they couldn't comprehend? Kenji felt their gaze like a physical pressure. Every nail he hammered felt like a blow to his own standing. He was risking the very thing he had fought to preserve, the respect of his men. The suspense was palpable. The external conflict was no longer between guard and prisoner, but had fractured and bloomed within the prisoner population itself. The screen was rising, a stark, skeletal monument in the center of the yard. But with every piece of lumber they added, Jack wondered what they were truly building and what the ultimate cost would be. The storm on the wall. The finished screen stood in the center of the compound like a pagan monolith, stark and white against the endless blue of the Arizona sky. It was a testament to their uneasy collaboration, a perfectly square, tautly stretched canvas that seemed to hum with silent potential. For 2 days, it had been the subject of intense scrutiny, a blank slate upon which both prisoners and guards projected their anxieties, their curiosities, and their fears. The evening of the first official movie night arrived, and the air was thick with a nervous energy that was entirely new. The usual oppressive silence was gone, replaced by a low, electric buzz of anticipation. American guards, usually rigid and alert, were more relaxed, some even joking quietly amongst themselves as they set up the folding chairs. Their casual demeanor was a stark contrast to the prisoners, who emerged from their barracks not as a unified group, but in hesitant, small clusters. Their faces were etched with a wariness that bordered on dread. This was no longer an abstract refusal. It was a line they were about to cross, and many were terrified of what lay on the other side. Kenji Tanaka stood apart, as always, a solitary figure near the front. His arms were crossed, his face an unreadable mask, but Jack could see the tension in the set of his shoulders. He had built the stage. Now he had to witness the play. His presence was a magnet, both for the anxious looks of his men seeking guidance and for the suspicious glances of those who still doubted his motives. Jack, his hands slightly trembling, threaded the heavy reel of The Wizard of Oz onto projector. The familiar, comforting where the mechanism was a sound of home, of Saturday matinees and popcorn. He offered a hopeful grin to the gathered Americans. All right, fellas, tonight we're not in Arizona. We're going to Kansas. The black and white images flickered to life on the pristine screen. Dorothy on the farm. Annie M., the kindly Professor Marvel. The prisoners watched, their postures stiff, their eyes cautious but engaged. The pastoral simplicity was alien, but not threatening. They followed the story of the lost girl, the sense of longing for a place that was safe. Jack began to feel a flicker of hope. Maybe this would work. Maybe the universal language of story would find a way in. Then it happened. The sky on screen turned a sickly, ominous green. The wind began to howl, a low, rising moan that grew into a deafening roar. The music, once gentle, twisted into a dissonant, terrifying crescendo. The tornado descended upon the farm, a monstrous, black funnel of pure destruction. It ripped the world apart. Fence posts tore from the ground. Chickens flew in a panic. The house shuddered and groaned, its windows exploding inward before it was wrenched from its foundations and sent spinning into the violent, chaotic void. To Jack and the Americans, it was a masterpiece of special effects, thrilling and exciting. To the Japanese prisoners, it was not a movie. It was a memory. It was a premonition. It was a documentary of their deepest terror. The terrifying howl of the wind was the scream of dive bombers. The shuddering house was the earth shaking under artillery fire. The violent, chaotic flight into the air was the sensation of being thrown by a concussed blast. They had endured the firebombing of their cities, the overwhelming, impersonal, destructive power of the American war machine. This was not entertainment. It was a traumatic echo, amplified 1,000 times by light and sound. A young prisoner near the front, a boy who couldn't have been more than 19, let out a strangled, involuntary cry. He stumbled backward, his legs buckling, and fell hard onto the dusty ground, scrambling away from a monstrous image as if it could reach out and consume him. It was a spark in a room full of gasoline. Panic exploded. Men recoiled as one, a wave of terror breaking their disciplined lines. Chairs overturned. The unified stoicism that had been their armor shattered into a raw, primal fear. The screen was no longer a window to another world. It was a portal to hell itself, and the monster was coming through. The American guards' relaxation vanished in a heartbeat. Their hands flew to the rifles slung over their shoulders. Their bodies tensed, ready for a riot. They saw the panic not as fear, but as a precursor to an uprising. The scene was seconds away from erupting into a catastrophic tragedy. A single nervous finger on a trigger would unleash a nightmare. Jack stood frozen at the projector, his blood running cold. His mind screamed at him to shut it off, to kill the monstrous image, but his limbs were locked. He had done this. His idealism, his stupid movie night, was about to get people killed, and then he saw Kenji move. Kenji did not look at the terrified guards. He did not look at the monstrous tornado on the screen. His eyes were only for his men. He moved not with speed, but with an incredible, deliberate calm. He walked directly to the young soldier, who was weeping in the dust, knelt beside him, and placed a firm, steadying hand on his shoulder. He spoke to him in low, rapid, urgent Japanese, his voice an anchor in the boy's storm of terror. Then he stood up and turned to face the panic crowd. He did not shout. He did not gesture wildly. He simply stood there, a pillar of absolute calm in the maelstrom of fear. His voice, when it came, was quiet, but it cut through the chaos with the clarity of a bell. "It is a story," he said, first in Japanese, his tone firm yet reassuring. Then he repeated it in clear, deliberate English, for the benefit of the guards whose fingers were whitening on their rifle stocks. "It is a trick of light. It is not real. Remember your discipline. Observe the technique, not the illusion." The effect was instantaneous. The panic didn't vanish, but it halted, frozen by the sheer authority in his voice. The men, shamed but profoundly reassured by their leader's unwavering presence, slowly settled. Their breathing began to slow. They looked at Kenji not as a collaborator, but as their protector, their sensei. He had navigated the crisis without violence, without submission. He had used reason to disarm fear. Jack finally remembered to breathe, a ragged, shaky gasp. He looked at Kenji, and in that moment, the categories of guard and prisoner, American and Japanese, dissolved. They were just two men who had stood on the precipice of a terrible abyss, and through one man's incredible courage, had managed to step back. The revelation was staggering. Their greatest fear wasn't each other. It was the misunderstood shadows they cast on each other's walls, the monsters they each believed the other to be. The real enemy had been on the screen, and Kenji Tanaka had just slayed it. A common language. The mood in the compound after the tornado scene was transformed. A collective, shaky exhale seemed to pass through the prisoners. The terror had been real, but Kenji Tanaka's calm intervention had acted like a balm, soothing the raw nerve. As the house landed with a jarring thud, and the screen dissolved from the chaotic gray of the storm into the breathtaking, almost unbelievable vibrancy of Technicolor Oz, a different kind of silence descended. It was a silence of awe. The Munchkin Land, a ride of color and whimsical design, was so far removed from any reality of war or imprisonment that it became a safe haven. The fear melted away, replaced by wide-eyed wonder. The Cowardly Lion's comical antics drew the first hesitant chuckles, sounds that were so foreign in the Arizona dust that men turned to look at each other in surprise. The Wicked, which was a fantasy villain, her evil clear and containable, not the ambiguous, terrifying evil of a bomb falling from the sky. When Dorothy finally clicked her heels together and whispered, "There's no place like home," the phrase hung in the air, weighted with a meaning every single man in that yard, American and Japanese, understood in the deepest core of his being. As the final credits rolled, the prisoners did not jump up or chatter. They rose slowly, quietly, as if emerging from a shared dream. Many looked thoughtful, their eyes distant, lost in the memories of their own distant homes. They filed back to their barracks, the usual rigid discipline softened by a pensive, almost gentle air. The screen, now blank and white once more, stood as a silent witness to the journey they had all just taken together. Jack Miller's hands were steady as he rewound the heavy film reel. The mechanical was the only sound in the now empty yard. He felt drained, but a profound, warm sense of peace was settling over him. He had not just shown a movie. He had navigated a crisis and witnessed a miracle of leadership. He was packing the projector into its sturdy case when he sensed a presence behind him. He turned. Kenji Tanaka stood there, his figure outlined by the faint light spilling from the guards' quarters. The desert night was cool now, the sky an infinite expanse of glittering stars. The barbed wire fences were just dark lines against the softer darkness of the desert. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The shared experience of the last hour lay between them, too large for simple words. The structure held, Kenji said finally, his voice quiet in the vastness of the night. The formality was still there, but the ice was gone. It did, Jack replied, matching his tone. It was well built. Kenji gave a single, slow nod. His eyes were not on Jack, but on the screen, as if still seeing the echoes of color. The transition from monochrome to color. It was an effective narrative device. A clear delineation between the world of struggle and the world of wonder. It gets you every time, Jack said softly, a genuine smile touching his lips. Kenji fell silent again, his gaze drifting from the screen up to the countless stars. He seemed to be searching for something in that cold, clear light. When he spoke again, his voice was so quiet Jack had to lean slightly forward to hear. "We were instructed," he began, the words chosen with immense care, "that you would use these things, these films, this music, to break us, to mock our culture with your loudness, to demonstrate your superiority in a way that would erode our spirit." Jack simply listened. There was no need to defend or explain. "And we were told," Jack offered in return, "that you were fanatics, that you'd rather die than accept a simple gesture of goodwill, that your honor was a kind of stubbornness that precluded any common ground." Kenji almost smiled. It was a tiny, fleeting thing, a crack in the marble facade that revealed the weary man beneath. "It seems we have both been listening to the stories of foolish men." He took a deep breath, the dry, cool air of the desert night. "The music in the film, the one the young girl sings about the place over the rainbow. It is about a land without trouble." "Yeah," Jack said, his own voice thick with unexpected emotion. "I guess that's a dream we all share, no matter where we're from." "Perhaps," Kenji said, his voice now barely a whisper, carrying a weight of heartbreaking wisdom. "Such a place is not a location on a map. Perhaps it is not a place one can ever truly find. He paused, and his eyes finally met Jack's in the dim light. Perhaps it is only a moment, a fleeting moment of understanding. Like this one. He gave a slight, formal bow from the waist, a gesture of deep respect that spoke volumes more than any flowery speech could. Thank you for the music, Corporal Miller. Jack, an American farm boy who had never bowed in his life, understood the language of the gesture. He nodded back, a deep, acknowledging dip of his head that held the same respect. Thank you for the structure, Mr. Tanaka. Without another word, Kenji turned and walked slowly back across the dusty yard toward his barracks. Jack stood alone by the projector, the silence of the desert settling around him once more. But it was a different silence now. It was no longer empty or oppressive. It was peaceful. The barbed wire was still there, a cruel and ugly scar on the land. The war was still raging across the ocean, a nightmare of unimaginable scale. They would all wake up tomorrow in the same roles, guard and prisoner, American and Japanese. But for one night, under a canopy of stars that belonged to no nation, a melody had woven its way through the fences. A shared story had proven stronger than years of propaganda. They hadn't found peace, but they had built a single, fragile bridge across a canyon of hatred and fear. They had discovered a common language built not of words, but of structure and song. And in the end, that single, quiet moment of human connection felt more transformative than any victory in battle ever could. Final slow pullback shot of the empty compound, the sturdy screen standing silent under the vast, starry sky. The sound of a gentle wind replaces the projector's whir. Faintly, almost imperceptibly, we hear a few solitary, poignant notes of "Somewhere Over the Rainbow" being plucked on shamisen. The music hangs in the air for a moment, a fragile, beautiful ghost, before it fades away into the desert night. This story reminds us that humanity can be found in the most unexpected places. If you believe in the power of connection and want to see more stories that bridge divides, subscribe to the channel for weekly doses of hope. Like this video if you were inspired, and turn on notifications so you never miss a story that can change your perspective.